A classified military facility located a few miles from the border zone was kept under vigilant guard. No unauthorized personnel were allowed in, and all access routes were patrolled on the ground and from the air. Inside one of the bunkers, with thick concrete walls, the highest-ranking staff had been urgently assembled. The atmosphere suggested a state of extreme readiness. Uniformed personnel stood by the metal doors, checking documents and IDs of anyone entering the conference room. Inside, the hall looked austere. A long table, several chairs, and bright overhead lamps. The officers present exchanged tense glances, aware of the severity of the situation. When the last participant entered and sat down, the senior official nodded at the guard by the door. It shut with a click, cutting off the sound of footsteps in the corridor. An officer in a dark green uniform rose to open the meeting. He spoke softly, but his words carried no hesitation. He reported a critical incident. 3 test subjects who had been administered a special DNA-altering serum had broken free and escaped near the Mexican border. According to him, these fugitives had the ability to transform into wolves by using a lycanthropy gene enhanced by the latest treatments. Their physical and regenerative capabilities surpassed those of ordinary individuals, even those who were armed. The officers at the table listened attentively, without interruption. The officer referenced official documents, clarifying that all 3 had served in the military in the past. He mentioned the age of the eldest, referred to as Alpha. This subject occupied a central role in the research program, as his samples had been used to create an improved version of the bestial form. He was vital for future experiments, which meant leadership insisted on capturing him alive. Then the officer said that the fleeing group included a woman named Anastasia, possessing tactical skills inherited from her father. She was adept at operating in the field, with special operations experience and high-level training. Should she resist, the order allowed for her elimination. Speaking of the 3rd subject, the officer changed his tone. He explained that this man had been classified as a particularly dangerous criminal in the past and was serving a life sentence in a secret military prison, convicted of a series of brutal murders. He had agreed to take part in the experiments to return to the battlefield, but now he had escaped and refused to follow orders. In the folder laid out on the table were his photographs, marked with notes on psychological instability and a total lack of empathy. Military command required that he be prevented from resuming combat activity at any cost. There would be no mercy. He was to be eliminated without waiting for further instructions. Having finished his report, the officer sat down, wiping the sweat from his forehead with his palm. Next, the head of the analytics department stood and opened a map of the area for those gathered. On the screen appeared border zone maps, with red lines indicating the fugitives' likely routes. According to intelligence, the trio was traveling through wooded areas and avoiding federal highways. Their tracks had been recorded near mountain trails leading south. The analyst concluded that they were not trying to cross the border openly, but were instead taking routes around the checkpoints. One of the generals at the far end of the table asked if the fugitives had any weapons aside from their bestial form. The officer replied that they had only a limited number of conventional firearms, but their beast-like nature could replace an entire arsenal. Moreover, they had been injected with a serum called evolutionary lycanthropy. which allowed them to remain in bestial form longer and maintain heightened regeneration. Standard bullets had proven ineffective against werewolves, and past encounters had resulted in the deaths of operatives. A silence settled over the room. Then the highest-ranking representative spoke, stating that for the purpose of capturing Alpha alive and neutralizing the others, an operation plan had been approved. It was called Hunt for Monsters. Officially, the pursuit was under absolute secrecy. The officer explained that emphasis would be placed on a group of super soldiers who had undergone special training and received adapted serums. They would be deployed to the border forests that very night. At the same time, ground patrols and aerial reconnaissance would be reinforced to cut off escape routes. The super soldiers would be issued toxic ammunition suited for combating werewolves. Then the general stood up and summarized. Alpha was important for future experiments, so suppression measures would be employed against him, but the woman was to be eliminated if she posed a threat. As for the third individual, the former lifer, his elimination was priority number 1. The order had been signed with no option for appeal. The meeting ended, and the participants rose, preparing for immediate action. In the corridor, communications officers and planning specialists were already waiting. Operation Hunt for Monsters received top priority, and everyone understood how dangerous this mission was. The High Command demanded swift results. The Super Soldier Unit received their orders through secure channels. The squad was made up of volunteers who had consented to have a special serum introduced into their bodies. Before being accepted into the project, each candidate underwent extreme physical endurance tests and psychological screening. Out of hundreds of applicants, only a few were selected, capable of withstanding the modification without serious side effects and gaining enhanced reflexes. In a spacious hangar used as a training base, team leaders laid out the plan for the upcoming mission. Several steel tables stood there, topped with weapon containers. In the upper drawers were large-caliber rifles, pistols loaded with toxic rounds, and special grenades filled with gases to suppress the beastly regeneration, along with other grenades armed with knockout gas. Military technicians were inspecting each piece of gear to ensure there were no defects. Medics were also present, ready to administer additional stimulants or antidotes. Command provided the super soldiers with all available information. The 3 escapees were former military operatives with special ops experience. All could transform into wolves using a combination of the serum and their own lycanthropy genes. One of them, the oldest, possessed unique traits, as he was considered the alpha carrier. High Command demanded he be taken alive, while the others were to be eliminated without question if they resisted. The reports detailed the combat history of a dangerous subject named Victor, who was considered uncontrollable even before the serum. Before heading out, the general announced important rules to the squad. He warned them that the werewolves were highly adept at navigating terrain and could move quickly. In their beast form, their senses were heightened, letting them detect approaching enemies in time. A direct frontal assault was unwise, since these enemies had immense endurance and could heal from their wounds. The general stressed that overconfidence would lead to heavy losses. The super soldiers were to act in unison and not take unnecessary risks. Despite the gravity of the situation, the squad maintained a calm determination, each soldier fully aware of the stakes. The serum in their veins sharpened their reflexes and made their muscles far stronger than those of ordinary humans. But none possessed the complete skill set of a full werewolf. They only had temporary advantages, which they had to use carefully. One of the tech officers showed off new grenades with a specialized launching mechanism, explaining that when detonated, they released a toxic gas capable of slowing a werewolf's regeneration. The super soldiers took careful note of these instructions, recording the equipment features on their electronic tablets. After the briefing, the group moved into the hangar where several helicopters awaited. Each aircraft was equipped with night vision devices, machine guns, and extra magazines of toxic ammunition. Avionics engineers were busy checking the rotor blades and communication systems. Staff officers were issuing final directives, consulting satellite images of the border forests. There were few obstacles in the aerial corridor leading to the target, but reconnaissance had warned that the terrain was rugged, with ravines and dense undergrowth. Outside, evening was setting in. The super soldiers donned light armor designed for close-quarters encounters. Each carried a set of special syringes on their belt, containing anti-lycanthropy agents and single-use injectors of a serum for short-term enhancement. The medic accompanying them quickly checked each soldier's condition, taking pulse readings and logging the data. None of them complained. Everyone understood the mission demanded absolute readiness. On the head instructor's signal, the troops took their places in 2 helicopters. The engines roared to life, a vibration coursing through the machines. The crews established communication with the command center and reported that they were taking off. Then the thunderous drone of the engines drowned out any further conversation. Lifting off from the concrete pad, the helicopters turned toward the southern edge of the base and vanished into the sky, heading for the border zone. The flight took about an hour. Inside the cockpit, the terrain outlines flickered on the monitors. The pilot spoke over a secure channel, occasionally adjusting altitude to evade radar detection. Through the small windows, faint lights from distant farms were visible, but most of the route lay over wilderness. Below them stretched forests and uninhabited expanses. The super soldiers stayed quiet, preparing for the landing. Each of them mentally reviewed the plan. Locate the fugitives, surround them, and strike with toxic grenades. After roughly 40 miles of flight, the pilots initiated their descent. A clearing large enough to land came into view below. The helicopters touched down gently, kicking up dust and fallen branches. The soldiers disembarked quickly, forming a defensive perimeter. One of the technicians unloaded containers of additional gear. Then the aircraft lifted off again, ready to provide air cover or evacuation if necessary. The super soldiers were left among the trees, guided by their night vision devices. Their objective was to advance west, where intelligence indicated the possible presence of werewolves. The team leader walked ahead, holding a device designed to detect bestial pheromones and trace thermal anomalies. The others followed in a column, maintaining distance. At the first sign of their targets, they planned to encircle the fugitives and deploy knockout gas. For several minutes, the squad moved in silence, their steps muffled by the carpet of fallen leaves. The air felt damp, and distant night birds occasionally called out. The instruments showed no movement, and radio traffic remained calm. Yet no one was fooled by the lack of contact. Reports clearly stated that the werewolves had been spotted farther south, so at least another mile lay ahead. The leader signaled the others to prepare for an ambush, aware that the beasts could easily have heard the helicopters and moved elsewhere. Meanwhile, the three fugitives had been traveling through forested areas, doing their best to avoid any encounters. They knew they were being hunted. Their route followed small rivers and deep ravines, places where they could more easily remain concealed. Alpha struggled to move. Toxic injuries prevented him from healing quickly. He spent most of his time in human form, since the act of transforming into a wolf drained his remaining energy. Anastasia kept an eye on him, and they paused periodically so she could change his bandages. Her hands trembled, but she tried to maintain an outward calm. She rarely let Victor out of her sight, hoping he would assume the lead. He pressed on, his steps tense, as though he still hadn't decided whether to keep fighting or give up. His conflicted thoughts showed in his actions. He realized he had once been part of the same system that was now pursuing them. One day they sheltered under a canopy of branches and thick shrubs. Rain began to fall, which could mask their scent and complicate the pursuit. Alpha, weakened by a recent attack, was gasping for air. Toxic bullets had left complex chemical traces inside him, causing unbearable pain. Victor briefly checked Alpha's pulse and said they needed at least a day for Alpha to regain enough strength to move on. Anastasia agreed. They thought about lighting a small fire, but Victor decided it was too risky. It would give them away with smoke. Instead, they huddled under wet foliage, barely keeping warm. Hunger was becoming a serious concern. They'd managed to scavenge some food a few days earlier when Victor stumbled on an abandoned spot with leftover supplies, but those were now almost gone. Hunting was too risky. Victor didn't want to draw attention with gunshots or traces of a predator. Images of their recent escape from the laboratory played through Anastasia's mind. It felt like it had happened only yesterday, though several days had passed. She tried to talk to Victor, asking what would happen next. He answered in a flat tone, reminding her that survival was their main priority. He made no secret of his dislike for the government, but thoughts of betrayal irritated him. He believed that no order was worth sacrificing human feelings. With each passing day, Alpha grew weaker. His bestial rage helped him hold on, but the toxins in the bullets had an ever-growing impact. Anastasia did everything she could, tearing her own clothing into bandages, rinsing his wounds with rainwater, watching him struggle to breathe. Victor suspected that without proper antidotes or medical care, Alpha wouldn't die, but his recovery could take an extremely long time. One night, when fog blanketed the forest, they heard a distant rumble in the sky. It might have been a patrol helicopter or a drone equipped with infrared cameras. Victor advised them to stay completely still. Anastasia crouched next to Alpha. Through the canopy, faint flashes of light flickered overhead. Victor realized the pursuers were searching for body heat. He quietly thanked the chilly air and heavy fog, which reduced thermal contrast. They remained undetected. Victor's doubts never left him. He knew the government would not stop until they were either captured or destroyed. At the same time, he could not abandon Anastasia and Alpha, recognizing that they were now his only allies. Perhaps Victor was used to working alone, but ever since their escape he felt a strange bond with Anastasia that drove him to protect not just himself, but her and her father as well. Another day passed. Moving through a swamp, they heard the crack of branches behind them. Victor immediately signaled to stop, yet the sloshing footsteps in the marsh were too indistinct to identify clearly. Victor motioned silently, and Anastasia pressed Alpha to the ground, trying to conceal their presence. Then everything went quiet. Maybe it was an animal or a lone scout. Victor didn't check, as taking that risk would reveal them. Soon they cautiously continued onward, distancing themselves from a potential threat. Thus time went by, tension growing, but the fugitives still had the skills to evade the dragnet. Victor hadn't forgotten that he once served in a top-secret military unit called ZOO, and he knew quite a lot about tracking methods. Anastasia trusted him, keeping herself composed. Together with Alpha, they decided to keep moving southwest to get closer to the Mexican border. They were worried about running into federal patrols, so they chose trails hidden from the main roads. Their route involved detours through groves and fields overgrown with tall grass and bushes. As they continued, Alpha had to stop more and more often, and Victor took on the task of shielding him from any unnecessary strain. He kept track of rest breaks and made sure they changed direction frequently, confusing their pursuers. Anastasia consulted with Victor about masking their scent. She knew that a wolf's sense of smell could give them away if there were traces of blood. So they regularly rinsed their clothes in streams, trying to wash off any signs of the wounds. One evening, they came upon a narrow dirt road where trucks carrying grain passed on occasion. Victor convinced the others to wait in the bushes to see if there was an ambush nearby. He climbed a small rise to observe the dusty road stretching south for several miles. Sagging fences were visible here and there. The area seemed deserted, as local residents had left before the hurricane seasons began. Victor returned and reported that he saw no immediate danger. Anastasia suggested using the road to speed up their journey, but Alpha shook his head and forced out a warning that the risk of encountering a patrol was too high. Victor agreed, so they once again turned toward the forest paths. At night it became harder to orient themselves, but the moonlight at least let them see the outlines of the trees. Their beast-like instincts helped them catch rustling sounds that hinted at potential threats. Despite his weakness, Alpha spoke with Anastasia, trying to keep her combat spirit up. He reminded her that they had to stay away from inhabited areas, since the government had undoubtedly warned the locals about possible criminals. Anastasia nodded silently, reflecting on how much she still didn't know about her father's past. She had always seen him as strong and invincible, and now she was witnessing his vulnerability. Victor sensed this shift in mood, but chose not to interfere. After they covered a few more miles, the forest began to thin. In the distance, they could see hills covered with low shrubs. According to Victor, there could be a strip ahead called the Outer Zone, where old abandoned plots lay about 1.5 miles from the river. If they managed to cross that river, the way to the border would be closer. But he knew there were likely increased patrols in that area. It was crucial to decide whether to risk going straight or look for alternative routes. Victor's internal turmoil still hadn't subsided. For years, he had believed he was indifferent to other people's lives. He preferred cold calculation, and he had agreed to the experiment only because he craved legitimate violence. Yet now he was unexpectedly feeling a connection to Anastasia. Whenever she glanced at him discreetly, he felt unfamiliar emotions stirring within. It threw him off balance, but at the same time gave him a reason to protect her. That evening, when they stopped for the night near a dried-up creek, Victor noticed Anastasia was exhausted, often closing her eyes. He wanted to show support, but was too accustomed to detachment to say much. He simply stated that they needed rest, and that in the morning they would figure out how to reach a safer place. Anastasia nodded, thanking him with a look that carried both fatigue and a hidden warmth. Victor barely slept that night, turning over the possibilities in his mind. If they kept moving without pause, Alpha might grow worse. If they stayed too long in one place, their pursuers could draw closer. The warm feeling he got when he thought about Anastasia told him he was no longer capable of acting like a soulless killing machine. He was beginning to feel responsible not only for the mission's outcome, but for her fate too. When morning came, Anastasia woke earlier than Alpha. Victor approached her and pointed out a side trail that led through some brush toward the foothills. He suggested they take that route instead of following the river directly. She agreed, and they gently woke her father. Alpha stood with difficulty, trying to hide his pain. He made no objection to the new plan. Heading south, they passed the remains of abandoned shacks where people had once lived. The walls were rotted, the roofs collapsed, and there was nothing left inside that anyone could use. Still, Victor managed to find a few dry boards in one corner, which he broke into pieces to build a tiny fire and boil water from an old tank. They managed to brew a kind of hot drink, flavorless though it was. For Alpha, it offered a slight relief, letting him catch his breath a bit. By evening, they set off once more, hoping to reach an area in a couple of days where crossing the border might be more realistic. Anastasia noticed Victor looking at her more often. A hint of unusual warmth had appeared in his eyes. She herself found it hard to figure out what was going on inside this man. She only knew that he had once been willing to kill without question, and now he was listening to her and caring for Alpha. Maybe it was just the common danger they all faced, but she sensed something else too. After walking almost non-stop, they discovered an abandoned hunter's cabin hidden in a sparse patch of forest. The place looked neglected. The walls were boarded up here and there, some boards rotten, and the windows were shattered. Still, it would at least protect them from the elements and give them a chance to rest. Victor was the first to step to the door, listening carefully before entering. The inside smelled of dampness and mildew, but otherwise seemed relatively safe. There were a couple of broken chairs. Victor glanced around, confirming there was no immediate threat. Anastasia guided Alpha inside and set him down on a tattered mattress. He was breathing heavily, though he soon steadied himself. He knew his strength was almost gone. That night a fever flared up, possibly from the infected wounds. Victor suggested they stay put so Alpha could recuperate and so they themselves could look for supplies nearby. In the morning, Victor and Anastasia went to check some buildings not far from the cabin. By the look of the trees, there must have been a hunting trail nearby at some point. On a clearing stood a few decrepit huts where some provisions might still remain. They moved carefully, listening for any sounds that might mean strangers were close. But there were no signs that people had been here recently. The doors were blocked by branches, the windows covered with dust. In one house, Anastasia found a medical kit, though the contents were past their expiration date. There were bandages, old vials with unknown labels, and some pills that looked like they could be for infections. She took everything that might be useful, wrapping it carefully in cloth. Meanwhile, Victor checked the kitchen. He didn't expect to find any proper food, but in one cupboard he discovered a partially spoiled bag of grain, which could still be helpful in a desperate situation. Looking out a window, Anastasia saw Victor standing near a hole in the wall, watching her. His face was edged with tension. She walked over, carrying what she'd found. He asked if she had heard anything suspicious. She shook her head. They decided to return to the cabin to treat Alpha's wounds. On the way, Anastasia realized she was starting to feel something like attachment for Victor. He was reserved, but he showed concern for her and her father. Once they were back, they found Alpha dozing fitfully, sweat beading on his forehead from his fever. Anastasia immediately unwrapped the bandages and vials. Victor helped lift Alpha's shoulder so she could tend to his wounds, and Alpha let out subdued groans during the procedure. He hissed in pain when the liquid from the vial touched his injured skin. He didn't resist. He was merely fighting to stay conscious. Anastasia couldn't be sure whether this would help, but she had no other options. As evening fell, Victor and Anastasia remained alone in the cabin while Alpha slipped into a restless sleep. Victor noticed that Anastasia had an injury of her own, a half-healed slash on her shoulder that she'd been hiding from her father. He quietly asked how she was feeling and offered to treat her wound. She nodded, allowing him to remove part of her clothing and examine it. He soaked a bandage in the leftover medicinal fluid and carefully pressed it against the damaged area. During this makeshift dressing, a silence fell between them. Anastasia looked up and said she could see unexpected changes in Victor. She had known him as calm and cold before, but now she was seeing concern in him that she never would have predicted. Victor did not deny it. He admitted he had long considered himself a soulless operative, killing whenever he had the green light from above. He had joined the secret program for the sake of violence alone. But now everything felt different. He confessed that he couldn't understand his own feelings, yet he knew he wanted to protect her, and that was something new for him. At first, Anastasia was silent. Then she gathered the courage to kiss him on the cheek. The gesture was gentle but laden with gratitude. For a moment, Victor froze, as he had never experienced such closeness before. Then he touched her shoulder and said he wasn't about to back away, that he wanted to figure out what was happening to them. Feeling the tension in the air, Anastasia realized she didn't want this moment to end. Night came upon them unexpectedly, pushing away thoughts of danger and letting them focus on the spark that burned inside. They gave themselves over to the moment, embracing one another. When dawn broke, they woke up lying next to each other. The sound of the wind outside and Alpha's quiet coughing brought reality back. Anastasia got up and dressed. Victor acted as though everything was proceeding according to plan, though inside he felt an unfamiliar surge of tenderness. He knew he had to check the surrounding area and couldn't let himself relax for too long. After getting dressed and grabbing his weapon, he stepped outside. The sky was overcast and the wind was picking up in the forest. Anastasia looked over at Alpha, who had barely registered what was going on but rasped out a question, asking if they were all right. She answered that they had a bit of time to gather some herbs and redress his wounds. He nodded and closed his eyes. It seemed he had no idea what had happened between Victor and Anastasia during the night. For a moment, a flicker of guilt passed through her, but she quickly remembered that survival was all that truly mattered now. Later, Anastasia spent the day checking the surrounding area for food. She returned to the shack where she'd found the medical supplies, hoping to uncover anything else useful. On the way, her mind kept going back to the night she and Victor had shared. Her heart pounded faster than usual, and she nearly missed the flapping of a large crow's wings overhead. Victor came back afterward, a guarded look on his face. He reported noticing scuffed tracks nearby, possibly human. Although he hadn't seen any clear signs, he had a feeling their pursuers were close. They concluded they couldn't afford to linger, as the government would almost certainly pinpoint their location. Alpha struggled to stand, bracing himself against the wall. His severe wound still wouldn't let him move without pain, but he managed a few steps. Anastasia gathered what little supplies they had, and Victor slung a makeshift pack over his shoulder with the bandages and the remaining medicine. Pulling open the cabin's warped, creaking door, they headed out into the gray dimness of the forest. The sky was covered in thick clouds, promising rain soon. They had only gone a few hundred yards when Victor sensed an unfamiliar presence in the air. There was no visible campfire, but the air felt charged. Anastasia noticed broken branches at their feet, as though someone had hidden in the brush recently. Hearing this, Alpha reminded them that the government wouldn't leave them in peace. Despite his weakness, he warned them to be ready for an ambush. After about an hour of moving forward, they caught a sharp smell, similar to the byproduct of burning chemical compounds. Victor recognized it as possibly the same gas they had encountered back in the lab, something that weakened lycanthropic power. Soon he spotted faint wisps of smoke drifting in the western part of the forest. Anastasia suggested circling around that sector, but Alpha pointed out that the route to the creek they needed lay in that direction. Staying put wasn't an option, but going straight ahead was risky too. Victor decided they should split their formation. He took Alpha in one direction, hoping to mislead their pursuers. Anastasia walked parallel to them, 20 yards away, trying not to lose sight of the others. The trees grew thinner, and the ground rose under their feet. After about 10 minutes, Victor halted, having picked up faint footfalls. He signaled Anastasia to take cover behind a thick tree trunk, while Alpha crouched behind a fallen log. Through the bushes, a small reconnaissance patrol emerged. 4 men in uniform wearing filter masks. One carried a device that looked like a motion scanner. Another had a rifle with a scope. They moved cautiously, spreading out. Victor felt the familiar surge of combat readiness within him. He indicated for the others to stay put, hoping the enemies would pass by. But one of the men halted, spoke quietly, and pointed his scanner toward where Alpha was hidden. The others raised their weapons. Victor realized he had to act instantly or risk being discovered. He darted out from cover, rushing the nearest soldier. That man managed to lift his rifle, but Victor knocked it aside with a powerful blow, then struck him with the rifle butt, sending him crashing to the ground. The second one got a shot off, grazing Victor's side. He felt the pain but barreled forward, kicking away the weapon before snapping the soldier's neck. The remaining two tried to deploy a gas grenade. One of them pulled the pin, but Anastasia fired her pistol, taking him down. The grenade fell into the grass, releasing a sharp smoke that spread all around them. The last soldier tried to retreat, but Victor caught up to him and broke his neck without hesitation. It was over in seconds. As the smoke cleared, the men in uniform lay dead on the ground. Anastasia emerged from hiding, struggling to steady her breathing. Alpha raised his head, seeing that the danger had passed. He muttered that this was just a recon group, and that a larger force was bound to be nearby. Victor realized they wouldn't escape without running into heavier firepower. There was no doubt now that the kill team had found their trail. Anastasia noticed blood on Victor's arm, but he waved her off, saying it was nothing serious. They stripped the fallen men of some extra ammo and searched their pockets. They found a few capsules containing a corrosive gas, but Victor knew he couldn't carry them safely without proper gear, so he left them behind, taking only a couple of smoke grenades. Then the group hurried to change position, aware that the noise of the fight and the lack of response from the scouts would soon draw the others in. Despite his weakness, Alpha commended the efficiency of their attack. Victor decided they should set up an ambush rather than let their enemies hunt them down at will. They picked a spot behind thick undergrowth with a sheer drop-off to protect their rear. Anastasia rigged a trap by stretching a tripwire across the approach and attaching a few grenades taken from the fallen soldiers. Victor knew the odds were stacked against them, but they needed some form of sabotage to hold the pursuers at bay. Alpha agreed, even though staying conscious was a struggle. He understood there was no avoiding a fight now. When the sounds of approaching footsteps echoed through the forest, Victor and Anastasia were already in position. Alpha lay in a small hollow, a pistol beside him. The super soldiers moved cautiously, never expecting an ambush to be set so near. At the first volley, 2 of the enemy went down. The others dropped to the ground, firing back in bursts, but Anastasia's precise shots kept them pinned down. Victor seized the moment, slipped around their flank, and struck from the other side. Before long, the gunfire subsided. Those still alive withdrew upon realizing their reconnaissance group had been wiped out. Victor and Anastasia assessed the damage. They had survived, but it was only a small victory. Now the enemy would surely respond with greater force. Alpha managed to reach cover, where they could dress their new scrapes. Victor knew that a more serious confrontation lay ahead, given that their opponents were better equipped and had greater numbers. Toward sunset, the forest noise faded, and a stifling silence settled over the trees. Victor, Anastasia, and Alpha found temporary shelter behind thick shrubbery at the foot of a low hill. They knew they would soon be facing the government's main forces. Their chances of survival were slim, but there was nowhere left to retreat. Alpha trembled under waves of pain, sometimes biting his lip to avoid crying out. Anastasia tried cooling his forehead with a damp rag, but the infection was clearly not abating. Victor took out his canteen and drank a few gulps of water, aware that thirst and fatigue were wearing him down. He glanced at the blood on his side, realizing the wound was deeper than he had first thought. Despite that, he wouldn't allow himself to relax. He looked around and noticed a short rock face to the left. Climbing it could give him a view of the area where the enemy would most likely pass. Deciding to take the risk, he asked Anastasia to stay with Alpha, then crept toward the rocky outcrop. Once at the top, Victor lay flat on his stomach, careful not to reveal himself. Below, about 200 yards away, was a narrow clearing that would be perfect for covert movement. If the enemy planned to advance, that was probably where they would do it. He squinted into the gathering dusk, trying to spot any motion. For a while there was nothing, but suddenly he caught a faint glimmer of a flashlight or night vision device. The enemy was close. Victor hurried down and warned Anastasia. They moved a bit farther up the hill, where the brush formed a kind of natural barrier. Alpha could barely stay on his feet. He suggested they keep moving south, but Victor replied there was no sense in running blindly. If they tried to flee now, they'd be shot in the back. He repeated that it was better to make their stand here, using the terrain to their advantage. Anastasia agreed, though fear for her father and for Victor gnawed at her. They had no more than 10 minutes to prepare. Anastasia scattered a few smoke grenades around their position to obscure the enemy's line of sight at the right moment. Victor readied his rifle. Alpha, clutching a pistol, pressed against a rock to conserve his strength. After a short pause, they heard rustling and muffled voices. The super soldiers were on the move. Anastasia fired first, picking off a target among the silhouettes shifting in the undergrowth. One opponent fell, and the rest quickly dropped down, returning fire. Victor waited for the muzzle flashes to pinpoint their location and then shot back with precise bursts. Several of the soldiers responded with suppressive fire, and one bullet grazed Victor's cheek, forcing him to duck. Alpha got off a few shots with his trembling hand. One bullet evidently hit its mark, confirmed by a pained shout from behind the bushes. The firefight lasted several minutes, growing more intense by the second. The super soldiers decided to push forward, using gas grenades under the cover of smoke to get closer to the slope. Anastasia spotted this in time and threw her own smoke bomb, retaliating in kind. Thick vapor clogged the air, accompanied by shouts, gunshots, and ragged coughing. Victor felt himself struggling for breath, but he clenched his teeth and kept firing. When the smoke lifted, some of the enemy fighters were already within 10 yards. Victor, in a half-wolf form, extended his claws and launched a ferocious strike on the nearest soldier. The soldier lashed out with a knife, slashing Victor's forelimb, but Victor tore through his neck. Another opponent took aim with a rifle, but Anastasia dashed in and shot him in the back. She felt a rush of adrenaline course through her, spurring rapid and decisive movement. A few of the soldiers tried to attack and capture Alpha, but Victor and Anastasia beat them back. Some super soldiers proved stronger than expected, as they, too, had serum-enhanced abilities. One of them grabbed Victor by the throat and slammed him to the ground. Victor, partially transformed, let out a snarl, baring his fangs and threw the enemy off, driving his claws into the man's chest. But Victor was losing a lot of blood, and his movements grew sluggish. By the end of the battle, many of the enemy began to retreat, realizing their numbers were dwindling. 2 stayed behind to cover the withdrawal, firing wildly. Anastasia crawled over to Victor, helping him steady his rifle. Together they unleashed a volley that dropped one more enemy, and the other tossed his weapon aside and vanished into the tree line. A strained quiet followed, punctuated only by the moans of the wounded. Victor lowered his head, struggling to catch his breath. His wounds burned and his muscles ached. Alpha found the strength to come closer, leaning against a stone. He surveyed the battleground. Fallen foes lay everywhere, intermixed with shell casings and the charred remnants of gas grenades. Their short-lived victory had come at a terrible cost. Victor had suffered several new injuries, and Anastasia had torn a side tendon while dodging automatic fire. Her jacket was soaked in blood, but she stayed on her feet. Alpha could barely stand, crippled by the inflammation in his wounds. Knowing they wouldn't have a long reprieve, Victor suggested finding a new hiding spot and moving farther, into territory where it would be harder to use helicopters and heavy equipment. Alpha shook his head, uncertain whether he could handle such a journey. Anastasia begged Victor not to leave her father behind. He assured her he wouldn't. He hoisted Alpha over his shoulder, biting back his own pain. Anastasia fashioned a makeshift bandage around her body so she wouldn't lose too much blood. Together, they headed deeper into the hills, leaving the recent battleground behind. By dawn, the sky took on pale hues, and the chill in the air stung their lungs. Victor, Anastasia, and Alpha reached a hilly region where the paths were winding and strewn with rocks. The dense tree canopy shifted to sparse evergreens. Alpha could barely keep going, each step triggering painful coughing fits. Anastasia tried to support him, though she herself was on the verge of collapse. Victor watched them with despair, knowing their endurance couldn't hold out much longer. Around midday, the faint hum of helicopters drifted in from the horizon. Victor immediately recognized the onset of a large-scale sweep. The air smelled faintly of fuel, and he could see the shapes of aircraft searching the mountain slopes at a distance. There were probably drones with thermal imaging and ground teams in pursuit. He realized that staying together would mean a swift end. Telling Anastasia that their only chance was to split up, he insisted she lead Alpha on a detour while he created a diversion. At first, Anastasia refused, begging him not to abandon her, but Victor explained succinctly. Soon the helicopters would pick up their heat signature and the pursuers would converge on the most obvious target. In his wolf form, he was faster and more elusive, and he could draw them away. If he lured them onto a false trail, Anastasia and Alpha might have a window to escape the trap and reach more remote areas. Alpha, lifting his head with difficulty, quietly agreed that this was logical. He understood that Victor was making a grim choice. Victor embraced Anastasia, softly promising he would return to her. Her voice trembled as she told him she would be waiting. No further words were needed. He gave Alpha a wordless nod, gathered what little gear remained, and fully transformed into his bestial form. Then he tore off downhill, deliberately leaving tracks for the pursuers to follow. Anastasia and her father veered southwest, trying to put as much distance between themselves and the helicopters as possible while they were fixated on Victor's movement. The chase after him began almost immediately. The helicopters hovered over the sloping terrain, dropping signal flares and scanning the area. In wolf form, Victor navigated obstacles, leaping over rocks and sprinting along narrow ledges. The smell of fuel filled his nostrils, and the roar of engines was deafening. Strike teams moved in from below, attempting to encircle him. Victor's only hope was to keep maneuvering in the mountains, where helicopters had trouble tracking him, and ground units struggled with the rugged landscape. Sometimes he would pause in a crevice to catch his breath and scan his surroundings. Bullets often whizzed nearby, chipping splinters off the stone. He could hear grenades detonating ahead, releasing toxic gases, and he used his wolf sense to avoid those zones. His muscles screamed with pain from previous injuries, and one leg threatened to give out, but he forced himself to keep running. The priority was to draw the hunters away. Meanwhile, guiding Alpha along rocky paths, Anastasia occasionally froze, listening to distant echoes of gunfire. She clenched her fists, aware that Victor was putting his life on the line to divert most of their enemies. Alpha assured her that if they managed to cross this small mountain chain, they would reach deeper canyons. There, helicopters struggled to fly and ground routes were scarce. They might find a place to hide and recover. Toward the end of the day, Victor made it to a plateau at higher altitude. Despite his wolfen form, he was trembling with exhaustion. Engines droned behind him, and the plain before him was dotted with rocky outcrops. Forcing himself onward, though he felt close to collapse, he bled from scrapes and bullet wounds that left a trail across the ground. At one point he slipped out of sight of his pursuers, diving into a gorge between two peaks. A heavy rain and the shadows of the crags concealed him somewhat. Victor took cover beneath an overhang, struggling for breath. Yet he could hear radio chatter above and knew he couldn't hold out much longer. Flattening himself to the ground, he tried to calculate his chances of escaping and of ever seeing Anastasia again. Did any such chance exist? He lay there for a long time, lungs burning with fatigue, dried blood caking his fur. He realized he would have to lead the chase even farther away, or Anastasia and Alpha might still be caught. Gathering the last of his strength, he emerged onto a windswept ledge. Below lay a moonlit plateau where he saw moving figures. Super soldiers scanning the terrain. Deciding to face them directly, Victor dashed downhill. The driving rain blurred his vision, and bullets kicked up splashes of mud around him. Switching to a hybrid form, he retained some of his beastly strength while keeping a more agile physique. The situation was dire, but he could not retreat. He had to take as many enemies with him as possible. The super soldiers opened fire, and Victor veered to the side, trying to reach a cluster of rocks. One enemy rushed forward with a weapon at the ready. Victor lunged, taking a bullet in the arm, but managing to slash the attacker's chest with his claws. The man choked and fell. An automatic volley rattled from the left, and Victor dove behind a boulder, stifling a groan from his fresh wound. Their squad leader shouted for the others to keep their distance, to encircle the werewolf rather than come in close. He understood Victor remained dangerous, even on the brink of collapse. Victor heard this and knew things would end badly for him. He was driven only by the thought that Anastasia had gotten away. It felt strange to care about another person, to hope to see her again, to want to be with her. He had never experienced such intensity of emotion before, and it was both blinding and thrilling. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive, and that sensation filled him with both awe and resolve. He decided to fight on until he could no longer stand. There was no fear in his wolf's eyes now, only a raw survival instinct. The leader stepped forward, waving a signal light as if challenging Victor to one-on-one combat. The others formed a semicircle, guarding the flanks. Victor advanced, shifting into a fuller beast form. Pain throbbed through him, but rage pushed him forward. The leader raised his rifle and fired a short burst. The bullets caught Victor's side, but he still limped ahead. Within a few feet of his enemy, Victor lunged and tore the weapon from the soldier's hands. A vicious hand-to-hand struggle broke out. The soldier, also boosted by serum, fought back with heavy blows, landing a powerful strike to Victor's head that sent him reeling. Victor retaliated by raking his opponent's face with his claws, drawing blood that spattered the ground. The leader refused to step back. For a few seconds they traded hits until Victor managed to force him down on one knee. Summoning his last ounce of strength, Victor drove his claws into the super soldier's chest, feeling bones crack beneath his grip. The man exhaled in a shudder and went limp. In that moment, a single gunshot echoed from the far side of the plateau. A sniper's round struck Victor in the back. He jerked, releasing the soldier's body and sinking onto the wet ground. His consciousness swam, darkness closing in around him. He sensed his life draining out through his wounds, and a cold numbness creeping in. A final flash of thought flickered in his mind. Anastasia, her eyes, the scent of her hair and skin, the memory of the wild night they had shared. He hoped she would survive. Then everything went black. For several days, Anastasia and Alpha made their way along remote mountain roads, avoiding any patrols they came across. Though still weak, Alpha managed to pull through the worst of his crisis. They found a narrow gorge where his condition stabilized somewhat. Each day they thought of Victor, but there was no way to know if he was alive. Deep down, Anastasia understood he had probably sacrificed himself so they could escape. Over time, the pursuit tapered off, and Anastasia and Alpha continued moving south, finding trails leading to lesser-known mountain passes. They traveled hundreds of miles, keeping their beastly nature hidden and passing themselves off as ordinary refugees. Occasionally, Anastasia felt a painful emptiness when thoughts of Victor surfaced. Years passed. Alpha recovered, though the injuries left him with limited dexterity. He settled in a coastal area of an Asian country where no one questioned his past. Anastasia learned to make a modest living by selling goods at the local market. She rarely spoke about what had happened, yet sometimes in her dreams she saw Victor's face and recalled his words and the look in his eyes. One day, in their new home, Anastasia stood in the bustling market square, picking out groceries for dinner. The air was filled with noise, with people speaking in multiple languages. The sun was warm, gently falling on her hair. Nearby, a young boy ran around, laughing and begging for sweets. Anastasia smiled, looking into his eyes, where a faint wolf-like glint sometimes flickered. The child's name was Victor, in honor of the man who had given them a chance at life. The boy was inquisitive, already showing certain unusual traits in his behavior. Returning to the small house they rented from a local fishing business, Anastasia saw Alpha fiddling with nets, promising to head out to sea with the fishermen that evening. Little Victor ran up to his grandfather, proudly showing him a bag of candy. Alpha nodded in approval. When dusk settled and the noise died down, Anastasia walked to the deserted shore. She knelt at the water's edge, gazing at the horizon. It seemed to her that somewhere out there, far away, Victor's spirit still roamed along a moonlit path. She whispered her gratitude for his presence in her life. She had never discovered the exact details of his fate, but she felt that a part of him would remain in her heart forever.